I clutched the keys to the Jeep Grand Cherokee in my hand, the metal cool and reassuring against my palm. 5 years of penny pinching, cutting back on groceries, working double shifts at the diner and skipping every indulgence I once thought I deserved had finally paid off. I'd saved for this moment, the day I'd hand Jason the keys to his dream car. He'd pointed at that exact model every time we passed the dealership on Main Street, back when he was just 16, his eyes lighting up with the kind of hope that only teenagers possess. "Someday, Mom," he used to say, and I'd nod with a smile, even when I knew someday felt like it was 1,000 miles away. But here I was, standing in front of a sprawling mansion in Austin, its facade gleaming white under the late afternoon sun, the sound of music and laughter spilling out from the wide-open doors. A rented mansion, I reminded myself, one of those luxury Airbnb listings with polished floors and rooms that echo because no one really lives there. I balanced a casserole dish in one arm and the keys in the other, hesitating at the doorstep. People milled about, all young and beautiful, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my entire week's paycheck. I smoothed my dress, feeling out of place even before I crossed the threshold. "Rose," someone called from across the lawn, but it was just a quick wave, one of Jason's friends whose name I never quite remembered. I forced a smile, stepping inside and scanning the room for him. The Jeep sat outside, polished to perfection with a bright red bow looped around its hood, practically shining against the Texas dust. I had parked it right at the front, exactly where he could see it the moment he stepped out. I finally found him near the back patio, his arm draped around Sophie, her blonde hair perfect, not a strand out of place. She wore a dress that shimmered when she moved, and I caught her glancing at my casserole dish with a look that was almost pity. "Mom," Jason called out, his voice loud and bright, but his eyes never quite met mine. I stepped forward, holding out the dish. "I brought this, in case you ran out of food." Sophie's laugh was sharp and quick. "Caterers, Mrs. Monroe. We have caterers." She flicked her wrist toward a line of waiters carrying silver trays piled with food that probably cost more than my grocery bill for a month. "Oh," I mumbled, pulling the dish back toward me. "I just thought, I wasn't sure. Mom, just chill. Everything's taken care of." Jason stepped forward, his hand gentle on my shoulder for the briefest of moments, but then his eyes lit up with something almost mischievous. "Actually, you can help me out real quick." Before I could respond, he plucked a silver drink tray from one of the nearby tables and pressed it into my hands. "Everyone, meet our waitress for the night," he called out, his voice carrying over the music, loud enough for the entire room to turn and stare. Laughter followed, sharp and immediate. Some of his friends clapped like it was a joke, like it was just another bit of harmless fun. I stood there, my fingers gripping the edge of the tray, the glasses wobbling slightly with the tremor in my hands. My smile was frozen, plastered on my face like it had been stapled there. I nodded stiffly, feeling my cheeks burn. Sophie leaned in close, her voice dripping with condescension. "You raised him right," she whispered, patting my arm before sauntering off, her heels clicking against the marble floor. I swallowed the knot in my throat and turned toward the patio, desperate to get out of sight before the tears threatened to spill over. I set the tray down on the edge of the railing, took a long breath, and smoothed my dress again. A ripple of laughter echoed from inside, loud and careless, like they hadn't just humiliated me in front of their friends. I didn't cry. Not yet. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I stepped back inside, weaving my way through the crowd, nodding politely to those who acknowledged me, even if their eyes carried pity or amusement. I kept my head high, my hands folded neatly in front of me, the casserole still clutched, against my chest like it might shield me from the shame. I made my way to the bathroom, the gold-plated faucet and marble countertops gleaming under the light. I locked the door behind me, set the dish on the counter, and just breathed. In and out, counting each inhale, steadying my hands against the cool stone of the sink. That's when I heard it. Voices, clear as day, filtering through the vent beneath the mirror. Sophie's voice first, sharp and careless. Told you the car would shut her up. A pause. Jason's voice. Softer, but unmistakably him. Still need the other papers signed. She's dragging it out. Sophie's laugh was quick, almost gleeful. Just get her to dinner next week. She'll cave. She always does. My breath hitched, and I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. My heart thudded in my chest, heavy and sick. Papers? What papers? My knees wobbled and I gripped the counter. Tighter, their voices faded. Laughter mingling with the thumping bass of the music outside. I stared at my reflection, at the woman in the mirror who still clutched that stupid casserole dish, still wore the smile of someone who wanted to believe her. Son was good and kind, and loved her the way she had always loved him. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Not after what I'd just heard. I took one last look at my reflection, wiped the edges of my eyes where tears threatened to break free, and unlocked the door. I left the casserole on the bathroom counter, forgotten and cold. I wouldn't need it anymore. When I stepped outside, the Jeep still gleamed under the lights, the bow now slightly crooked. I walked past it without looking back, my mind already spinning with questions, doubts, and the sharp sting of betrayal. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The drive back from the mansion felt longer than usual. The winding roads of Wimberley, stretching out beneath the weight of what I'd overheard. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles whitening with each passing mile. My mind replayed their voices through the vent, looping like a broken record. Told you the car would shut her up. Get her to dinner next week. She'll cave. The Jeep sat parked in my driveway, the red bow now wine-tossed and tangled. I looked at it for a long moment before heading inside, the door creaking behind me as I stepped into the silence of my modest living room. The walls still wore the same pale yellow paint I'd slapped on them 20 years ago, when Jason was just a boy, and the house was full of noise and life. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and walked straight to the small oak cabinet in the hallway. My hands moved instinctively, sliding out the bottom drawer and reaching for the iron lockbox buried beneath a stack of old Christmas decorations. My fingers fumbled with the key, heart thumping louder than it should have. When I finally flipped the lid, the familiar smell of old paper and dust greeted me like an old friend. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. My birth certificate, Jason's hospital records, the title to my old Buick, and my father's will. I rifled through the neatly stacked envelopes, fingers brushing over the familiar documents, until I reached the one that should have been there, but wasn't. The deed to my father's house, the last piece of him I had left. The small creaking cabin he'd built with his own hands, nestled at the edge of Blanco River, where I'd spent every summer learning to fish and catching fireflies, with Jason. My father had left it to me when he passed, the deed tucked safely away for years. Until now. I emptied the entire contents of the box onto the floor, papers scattering across the carpet. I checked every file, every envelope. Nothing. Panic settled in my chest, spreading like wildfire. I ran to my desk, flinging open drawers, rifling through old tax forms, utility bills, insurance papers. Still nothing. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone off the counter and dialed the number for the Hayes County Clerk's office. My fingers fumbled over the numbers, but I managed to press the call button. Hayes County Clerk's office. How can I help you? The woman's voice was cheerful, oblivious to the storm brewing on my end. I'm calling to check the status of a property I own. My father's old house out on Blanco River. I want to confirm it's still under my name. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the tremor slipped through. Of course, ma'am. Do you have the parcel number? I didn't. I had barely glanced at that document in years, but I gave her the address, my voice shaking slightly as I spelled it out. There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking in the background, each one hitting me like a drumbeat. Looks like it was transferred about 6 weeks ago, she finally said, her voice still painfully pleasant. Transferred? The word caught in my throat. To who? Brightway Holdings, she replied. Filed with the county on March 18th. I felt my knees weaken, and I sank down into the chair beside me. There's no way. I didn't transfer anything. Are you sure? Another pause. It's right here in the system. Transferred by you, notarized by a Mark Monroe. Does that name sound familiar? My stomach twisted violently. He's my brother. My voice cracked, and I swallowed hard. And you're saying it was signed by me? Yes, ma'am. Her tone softened, finally catching onto the tension in my voice. We have your signature on file. My hands shook, knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the table. Was it notarized? Yes, ma'am. By Mark Monroe, stamped and filed. I couldn't breathe. I mumbled a quick thank you, disconnected the call, and dropped the phone onto the table. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the air too thick to draw into my lungs. Mark had done this. Jason had done this. And they had done it while I was oblivious. My mind flashed back to that foggy April afternoon, 2 months ago, when I was recovering from eye surgery. Jason had shown up at my door with a stack of papers in his hand. It's just insurance stuff. Mom, he'd said, setting them down in front of me. I'd barely been able to read then, the world blurry and soft around the edges. He'd been so calm, so helpful, flipping through the pages and pointing to where I should sign. I hadn't even questioned it. My hands flew to my mouth as I replayed the memory. The tight smile on his face. The way he hovered, watching me scribble my name over and over, his hand ready to flip to the next page. They'd taken the house. My father's house. A knock on the door shattered the silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I stumbled too, my feet wiping my face with the back of my hand before yanking it open. Tammy stood there, eyes wide with concern. Hey, I got your text. What's going on? I pulled her inside, locking the door behind her. They took it, Tammy. They took the house. My voice cracked, and I saw the shock register in her eyes. Who? What are you talking about? I didn't bother answering. I pulled her into the living room, the papers from my lockbox still scattered across the carpet like pieces of my life ripped apart. I dropped to my knees and grabbed the pile of papers, shoving the ones I'd pulled from the clerk's office online in her hands. She skimmed them, her eyes going wide. Brightway Holdings? What the hell is that? Some fake company. My hands were still shaking. Jason and Mark transferred the deed. I didn't even know. Tammy's eyes narrowed as she flipped the paper over, inspecting the fine print. There's only one name listed under officers, Sophie Lane. Her name hit me like a punch to the gut. Sophie. The same Sophie who'd humiliated me at that party, who'd laughed when Jason called me the help. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his accomplice. Tammy dropped the papers on the table, her eyes sharp. Looks like we've got a fight on our hands. I nodded, my chest tightening. And I'm not backing down. The kitchen clock ticked softly, its hands creeping past midnight as Tammy and I sat hunched over the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of us like the remnants of a storm. My living room still looked like a crime scene. Files, envelopes, and torn open drawers scattered across the floor. But here, in the soft glow of the kitchen light, it felt like something sharper was taking shape. Tammy sipped her coffee, eyes narrowed at the stack of papers we had pulled from online records. "Look at this," she said, tapping her finger on the screen of her laptop. "Brightway Holdings, registered 2 months ago." I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The LLC had been filed under a Sophie Lane, her name neatly typed in as the sole officer. Address listed as some suite number in downtown Austin, probably just a front. She's not just his girlfriend. She's his business partner, I muttered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. They did all of this behind my back. "More than just behind your back," Tammy said, scrolling further down. "Look, the registration date matches right before your surgery. This wasn't impulsive, Rose. This was planned." I stared down at the signature on the deed transfer. My own name, neat and even. But I hadn't written it. My mind flashed back to that afternoon, still groggy from anesthesia, Jason flipping through page after page, nodding with that too-wide smile. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white. "I didn't sign it," I whispered, more to myself than to her. He slipped it in with the insurance forms, and I signed without looking. Tammy's gaze softened for a moment, but she shook it off quickly, her eyes steeling. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is proving it." She slid her laptop across the table. I checked the county's notary logs. Mark notarized it. Twice. Twice? I blinked, my hands fumbling over the paperwork. "Why would it need 2 notary stamps?" Tammy smiled, sharp and wolfish. "Because the first one wasn't good enough. I'm guessing he needed it redone to match something in their LLC filing." She pulled up another screen, highlighting a scanned document. "See? The first stamp is smudged, but the second one? Clear as day." My heart pounded as I looked over the documents, connecting the pieces in my mind. This wasn't just Jason taking something he felt entitled to. This was calculated. Professional. I took a deep breath, the air scraping against my lungs. "They think they've won. They think you won't fight back," Tammy corrected, her eyes flashing. A silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. Then she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So what's the plan? You can't just walk up to them and say, 'I know you stole my house.' They'll lawyer up before you even finish the sentence." I reached for the pile of papers, sifting through until I found the transfer documents. "I don't want them to know I'm coming. Not until I'm ready to bury them." Tammy raised an eyebrow, a slow grin spreading across her face. "I'm listening." I slid the papers to the side, clearing a small space on the kitchen table. "We need proof, not just speculation or documents. I want them to say it, to admit it." "How do you plan to do that?" I smiled then, the first real smile I'd felt in days. "A family dinner." Tammy laughed, low and sharp. "You're kidding." "Think about it. They think I'm clueless. They think I'm still groggy from surgery and grateful for that. Damn Jeep." I spat the last word out like it was poison. "If I invite them over, act like I'm ready to forgive and forget, they'll come. They'll talk, and we'll be ready." Tammy leaned forward, her voice dropping. "We can bug the place. Hide cameras." "Exactly," I nodded. "I want every word recorded. No more whispers through vents. I want them on tape." Tammy's grin turned feral. "I know a guy. Sells nanny cams, no questions asked. You can tuck them into vents, wall fixtures, even plant pots." We stayed up late into the night, scribbling notes, cross-referencing timelines, and highlighting every detail. Tammy found 3 local places where Sophie Lane had signed her name on public records, 2 business contracts and a loan agreement. She printed each one out, laying them side by side with the deed transfer. The signatures were identical. Too identical. "No one signs the same way every time," Tammy pointed out. "Unless it's a stamp or a copy." I nodded, flipping through the emails Jason had sent me during my recovery. Harmless-looking attachments, insurance claim forms, medical disclosures, all filled with tiny print I never bothered to read. He'd sent them under the guise of helping out, while I was too weak to manage on my own. I stared at the subject lines, my jaw tightening. He used my recovery to get what he wanted. Tammy's hand rested on my shoulder, firm and steady. Not for long. We spent the next hour setting up the plan. Tammy wrote out the invitations by hand, sealing them in plain white envelopes. I texted Jason directly. Family dinner, just like old times. I want you, Sophie, and Mark here. Let's put the past behind us. The dots on my screen appeared immediately, followed by his reply. Can't wait, Mom. I stared at that heart emoji until it blurred, my chest tightening with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Rage. He was so confident, so sure of his own deception, but not for long. Tammy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We're going to burn them down. I met her gaze, steel in my voice, and I'm going to enjoy every minute of it. The late afternoon sun spilled through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the dining room walls. I watched the light shift and bend as I smoothed out the linen tablecloth. My mother's, the one she only brought out for holidays and birthdays. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the chest I kept it in, pressed and perfect, like she'd left it just for this moment. Tammy bustled around the room, her hands moving quickly but deliberately. She adjusted the silver candlesticks at each end of the table, angled just right for the hidden cameras to catch their faces. The cameras were Tammy's idea. A friend of a friend had supplied them. Discreet little things that fit neatly into the vent covers and wall sconces. I'd tested each one myself, watching the feed from my laptop, marveling at how clearly you could see every angle of the room. They won't suspect a thing, Tammy said, her voice low but electric with excitement. She pressed the final camera into the fake plant by the window, testing its angle before nodding with satisfaction. I stepped back, taking in the full scene. The dining room looked beautiful, soft, welcoming, untouched by the weight of betrayal that hung in the air. I'd polished the silverware until it gleamed, each fork and knife perfectly aligned. Plates were set atop chargers, pristine and white, edged in silver. I'd even pulled out the crystal water goblets I hadn't used since my father's last Christmas with us. It's perfect, I whispered, more to myself than to Tammy. She just nodded, hands on her hips, appraising the room like it was her own masterpiece. We had spent hours setting it up, making it look not just like a dinner, but a celebration. As if nothing had changed. As if I were still the proud mother, hosting her family with joy and pride. It had to feel that way. It had to look that way. Did you do the envelopes? Tammy asked, her voice breaking my thoughts. I nodded and moved to the kitchen counter where I had placed 3 white envelopes, each sealed and marked with their names in my neat handwriting. I held one up to the light, the faint outline of the documents inside just visible. Copies of the deed transfer, the LLC registration, and the public notary logs. Proof of their betrayal, bundled up neatly like a gift. I placed one at each setting, Jason, Sophie, and Mark. Perfectly centered on their plates, tied with a single ribbon of red silk. It almost looked festive. Tammy stepped back, brushing her, hands off on her jeans. This is going to be one hell of a dinner. I met her eyes, holding my gaze steady. I don't just want them to squirm. I want them to choke on every lie they've told. Tammy's smile was slow and wicked. They will. I moved to the corner of the room where my mother's china cabinet stood, untouched for years. I pulled open the glass doors and retrieved the silver serving tray, polished and gleaming. I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, remembering the last time I'd seen it used. Christmas dinner, the year before Dad passed. Jason was only 13 then, still, bright-eyed and full of dreams. I swallowed hard, pushing the memory away. Tammy watched me carefully. You ready for this? I nodded, the hesitation long gone. More than ready. We did a final sweep of the room, testing the cameras one last time. The screens in my laptop showed every angle. The main table, the window seat, the entryway, from the kitchen. No blind spots. No mistakes. Tammy set up her laptop in the spare room, the screens glowing with live feeds. She had a backup hard drive, a microphone clipped to her lapel, and a second camera running on her phone, just in case. I couldn't help but smile at her thoroughness. When this all goes down, Tammy said, clicking through the feeds, I want you to keep your cool. No yelling, no breaking. You stay strong, you stay steady, and you let them unravel themselves. I nodded, more to convince myself than her. I will. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, making my heart jolt in my chest. Tammy grinned, her eyes sparkling. Showtime. I smoothed my dress, straightened my shoulders, and walked to the door. My hands were steady, my breath even. I could hear their voices before I even pulled it open. Laughter, bright and careless. The kind of laughter you only hear from people who are absolutely sure they've gotten away with something. I opened the door, and there they were. Jason, his arms slung casually around Sophie's shoulders, her blonde hair catching the evening light. She held a bottle of wine, waving it like it was a gift instead of a bribe. Behind them stood Mark, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight like he couldn't wait to leave. Mom! Jason grinned wide, stepping forward to wrap me in a hug that was all shoulders and no warmth. We brought wine. Sophie stepped inside, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she moved. We were just saying how nice it is to do this. You know, family dinners, like old times. Like old times, I echoed, letting the words hang. In the air. They moved past me, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the truth tucked neatly inside white envelopes, waiting for them at the table, completely unaware that every word they spoke from this moment forward would be recorded and locked away. As I closed the door behind them, I caught Tammy's eye from the hallway. She gave me a nod, subtle but sure. The game had started. The clinking of wine glasses and the soft murmur of forced conversation filled the dining room. Jason sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. He wore that confident grin of his, the one I used to think meant he was happy, but now I recognized it for what it was, arrogance. Beside him, Sophie flashed her perfect white smile at every small joke he made, her manicured hands wrapped around the stem of her glass. Mark sat across from them, eyes darting around the room, barely touching his food. I served the roast chicken, with all the usual sides, scalloped potatoes, green beans with bacon, and fresh rolls. I moved with precision, my hands steady, my voice smooth as I poured their drinks and nodded along to whatever superficial nonsense Sophie babbled about. It really is lovely here, Rose, she said, swirling her wine with a practiced elegance. I just love the rustic charm. I smiled politely, ignoring the slight in her tone. Thank you, Sophie, it's home. Jason raised his glass. To family dinners and fresh starts, he said with a wink. Sophie clinked her glass to his, and Mark followed with a hollow smile. I raised my glass too, letting it hover for a moment. To family, I replied, and the word slipped out like a dare. We drank, and I watched them settle in. Jason laughed, a little too loudly. Sophie's gaze flickered toward me with each sip, and Mark chewed his food like he was counting the bites. The room smelled like rosemary and lemon, a comforting scent that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. When the plates were nearly empty and their glasses refilled, I stood up, smoothing my dress and setting my napkin neatly on the table. I have something for each of you, I announced, my voice steady and calm. Jason raised an eyebrow, exchanging a glance with Sophie. Something for us? I smiled. Yes, a small gift. I walked to the sideboard where I had placed The envelopes earlier, tied with red silk ribbons, just like party favors. I picked them up, one by one, feeling the weight of each as I moved back to the table. I started with Mark, placing his in front of him. He looked up, eyes wide, and mumbled a quiet thanks. Sophie was next, her manicured fingers wrapping around the edge of the envelope, her smile faltering just slightly. Finally, I handed Jason his, pausing just long enough to watch his grin fade as he took it from my hand. "What is this?" he asked, half laughing as if it were all a joke. "Go on," I said, taking my seat and folding my hands neatly in my lap. "Open them." For a moment, no one moved. Then, almost in sync, they pulled at the ribbons, the silk slipping away to reveal crisp, white envelopes. Sophie tore hers open first, her eyes scanning the contents. Her face drained of color, mouth slightly open. Jason flipped through his, brow furrowing deeper with each page. Mark held his with shaking hands, reading each line as if it might change, if he looked long enough. Sophie was the first to speak. This doesn't mean anything." Her voice wavered, but she forced a laugh. "It's all legal. Everything we did is legal." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Legal?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "You mean forging my signature while I was under anesthesia? Stealing my father's house? Or perhaps you're referring to the LLC you created 2 months ago under the name Brightway Holdings, the one you registered using my property as collateral." Sophie's eyes flashed, and she tossed the papers onto the table like they were trash. "You don't have proof," I smiled, then a slow, measured smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." I reached beneath the table, sliding my hand to the small remote taped under the edge of my chair. I pressed the button, and the hidden speakers Tammy had rigged crackled to life. Sophie's voice, crisp and clear, filled the room. "Told you the car would shut her up." Sophie's face blanched. Jason sat up straighter, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The recording continued, unflinching. "Still need the other papers signed. She's dragging it out." I watched Sophie's expression go from shock to rage in the span of seconds. "Where did you get that?" she spat, her voice edged with desperation. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Tammy stepped out from the hallway, her laptop tucked under one arm. She set it down at the end of the table and flipped the screen around, tapping the space bar. Images flickered to life. A scanned copy of the LLC registration with Sophie. Lane listed as the sole officer. Mark Monroe signed off as the notary. Tammy clicked again, bringing up the notary log, side by side with my supposed signature. "That's not," Jason stammered, his face pale. "It is," Tammy interrupted, voice sharp and unyielding. "We cross-referenced your signature from the DMV, her medical records, even her bank forms. This?" She jabbed a finger at the screen. "This is forged. Badly, I might add." Mark looked like he might be sick. He turned to Jason, whispering something I couldn't catch. Jason shook his head, his eyes fixed on me, fury building in, his stare. Sophie slammed her glass down, the sound shattering the silence. "This won't hold up in court," she hissed. I smiled again, calm and steady. "It won't need to." I leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "You see, I'm not taking you to court. I'm taking you to the public." Jason's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" "It means," I replied, standing up and smoothing out my dress, "that I'm done pretending you're my son. I'm done pretending you're my family. I'm cutting you off, Jason, from everything. You get nothing. No inheritance, no property, not a single dime from me. Ever." The silence that followed was absolute. Jason's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for breath, and Sophie's eyes burned with rage. Mark just stared at his hands, shaking his head slowly, over and over. Tammy clicked the laptop shut, breaking the silence. I think dinner is over. I watched them, memorizing the looks on their faces, branding them into my memory. For the first time, I didn't feel weak. I didn't feel small. I felt free. The screen in front of me flickered, its light casting long shadows across the living room walls. Tammy sat next to me, legs crossed and fingers flying across the keyboard. We had spent the last 3 days combing through the footage, every sneer, every nervous glance, every desperate lie they'd tried to sell me over my own dining room table. It was all there. Sophie's voice, crisp and clear, bragging about shutting me up with the car. Jason's silence as I laid out the evidence. Mark's nervous whispers when he realized his notary stamps were right there in black and white. "Okay," Tammy said, hitting the spacebar. The video paused, frozen on Jason's stunned expression. "That's the last clip. Ready to publish?" I stared at the screen, my heart thudding so loudly I thought she might hear it. But there was no hesitation in my bones. I was done being their victim. I nodded. "Do it." Tammy grinned, the kind of smile that stretched all the way to her eyes. She clicked once, then twice, and suddenly it was live. The truth about Brightway Holdings, the title stark and bold against the backdrop of my dining room. We watched as the view count ticked up, first by tens, then hundreds. Comments started to roll in, short and sharp. "This is insane. How could they do that to their own mother? Sophie and Jason are monsters. I hope she sues them into the ground. My mom went through the same thing. So proud of you for standing up." I leaned back, the tension slipping from my shoulders for the first time in months. Tammy reached over, squeezing my hand. "I told you it would work." And it did. By the next morning, the video had over 10,000 views. By lunch, it hit 50,000, with shares bouncing across Facebook, Twitter, and even local community forums. I didn't need to do a thing. The story carried itself: an aging mother, her only son, and the betrayal that nearly cost her everything. It wasn't just a story. It was a warning. 2 days later, I woke up to a flurry of messages. My phone buzzed endlessly, the screen lighting. Up with notifications from strangers, some sharing their own stories, some just offering support. One woman from Nebraska wrote, "My daughter did the same to me. You gave me the strength to fight back." Another from Florida sent a private message. "You're a hero. Never let them take your voice." I read each one, my eyes blurring as I scrolled through. I had been so wrapped up in my own pain, my own humiliation, that I hadn't realized just how many others had lived through the same. Tammy watched me from across the room, her face softening. "You started something, Rose." I looked up, holding her gaze. "I'm finishing it, too." The first real crack in Jason's world came a week later. His HVAC business, his pride and joy, began drowning under the weight of public opinion. Yelp was littered with 1-star reviews, each one more vicious than the last. "Don't trust a thief with your air conditioner." "Scammer. Stole from his own mother. Who does that?" "If he can rob family, he'll rob you too." I knew. It was just the beginning. Tammy sent me a link to Facebook Marketplace, where his business van had been listed for sale. I clicked the image, smirking at the urgent sale tag plastered across the top. Sophie didn't fare much better. 3 weeks after the video went viral, her real estate license was suspended pending investigation. Someone had sent the video, along with public record screenshots, to the Texas Real Estate Commission. Her office had released a statement saying she was on leave pending legal review. I imagined her sitting in her office, blinds drawn, watching everything she'd built crumble around her. I almost felt bad. Almost. Mark? He disappeared. His Facebook was deleted, his LinkedIn wiped clean. I hadn't heard a word from him, and I didn't expect to. He always did run when things got hard. The video continued to spread, now climbing past 100,000 views. News outlets picked it up, calling it family fraud, the tale of betrayal and resilience. I ignored their calls, for interviews, their emails requesting comments. I didn't need their microphones or their headlines. I had the truth, and it was loud enough. A month passed before I saw any of them again. Jason tried to call twice, then texted me a long-winded apology that read more like a business memo, polished and hollow. I deleted it without replying. Sophie attempted to reach out through a mutual friend, saying she wanted to make things right. I never responded. It was over. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through another flood of messages, women from all over the country sharing their stories, when I heard the clatter of the mail slot. I stood, crossing the room to pick up the pile of envelopes now scattered across the floor. Bills, advertisements, the usual. And then I saw it. A thick white envelope, sealed with the insignia of the Hayes County Clerk's office. My breath caught in my throat as I ripped it open, fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single document, crisp and flawless, the deed to my father's house. My name, clear and bold across the top, no fraudulent signatures, no lies, just mine. I pressed the paper to my chest, eyes slipping closed as relief flooded through me. It was back. The house was mine again. No one would ever take it from me. I took a deep breath, folding the document carefully back into the envelope and setting it on the kitchen table. Tammy came in from the living room, her eyes darting from my face to the envelope. "Is that—" I nodded, unable to keep the smile from spreading across my face. "Well," she said, pulling out a chair and flopping into it with a grin. "What, now?" I slid into the seat across from her, my hand resting on the deed like it might disappear if I let go. "Now?" I asked, my eyes locking with hers. "Now, we rebuild." The house stood at the end of a winding dirt road, nestled between towering oaks and sprawling fields of bluebonnets. My father had built it with his own hands. Every plank, every nail, every brushstroke of paint. It had always been his pride. And now it was mine again. The first time I walked back through that front door, the smell of dust and age clung to the air, but underneath it all, I could still catch hints of him. Cedar wood, tobacco, and that faint aroma of freshly cut grass. It was like stepping into a memory, one that had been tucked away for too long. I ran my hands along the walls, feeling the grooves and scratches left by years of living. Pencil marks where he measured my height as a child, dents in the doorframe, from when I learned to ride my first bike. It was all still here, untouched and waiting. Tammy joined me every morning, toolbox in hand, her sleeves rolled up and ready to work. We started with the kitchen, scraping off layers of old wallpaper, sanding down the cabinets until they shone. We painted the walls a warm, buttery yellow, the same shade my mother used to love. Next came the living room, where we replaced the sagging floorboards and hung new curtains that swept the floor in soft, pale blue. It took us weeks of scraping, painting, hammering, and hauling out what was broken. But the house came, back to life, piece by piece, until it was whole again. Until I was whole again. The last room we tackled was the spare bedroom. It had been used for storage for years, filled with boxes of my father's old tools and faded family photos. Tammy stood in the doorway, hands on her hips. "You sure about this?" I looked around, taking in the space. It felt like possibility, like hope, stretching out before me. "Yes," I said firmly. "It's time." We cleared it out, top to bottom, scrubbing the windows until they gleamed, painting the walls a soft lavender that caught the morning light just right. I bought a twin bed, a sturdy oak dresser, and crisp white linens. I set a vase of wildflowers on the nightstand, the petals catching the sunlight and casting shadows on the walls. I hung a sign on the door that read, "The Nest." "What exactly is this going to be?" Tammy asked one morning, sipping her coffee, as she watched me make the bed with military precision. "A place for women," I replied simply. "Women like me. Women who've been manipulated, stolen from, pushed aside. A place where they can get back on their feet." Tammy's eyes softened, and she nodded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's real good, Rose." And so, the nest was born. It started small, one woman, then two. Word spread through whispers and community boards, through friends of friends who knew someone who needed help. Women who had been conned by their own families, stolen from by their own children, betrayed by people who should have protected them. I listened to their stories late at night in the kitchen, mugs of tea between us, the house creaking softly in the wind. I watched their eyes light up when they realized they weren't alone, that someone believed them, that someone understood. They stayed for weeks, sometimes months, until they were ready to move on. Some found jobs, some reconnected with friends, or family they had been cut off from. But each one left stronger than when they arrived, a little taller, a little braver. I watched them go with a full heart, knowing my father would have been proud. His house had always been a place of refuge, a place of safety. Now it was mine, and I was carrying on that legacy. Tammy joked that I'd turned the place into a sanctuary for the brokenhearted, but I knew it was more than that. It was redemption, stitched together with hard work and forgiveness, with hope and second chances. We were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the trees, when Tammy nudged my shoulder. "You did it, you know. You really did it." I looked around at the freshly painted shutters, the new roof, the garden that was finally starting to bloom. And for the first time in a long time, I felt it. Peace. But peace is never permanent. Not really. It was late one evening when I heard the knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Tammy had already gone home, and the women staying with me were out on a walk. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the front porch. I wiped my hands on my apron and moved to the door, my heart thumping just a bit faster. When I opened it, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. There, standing on my porch, hands in his pockets and eyes rimmed with red, was Jason. His hair was longer than I remembered, his face more gaunt, shadows pooling under his eyes. He looked older, beaten down, but still recognizable. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking just a bit. "Can I come in?" I stood frozen, my hand still on the doorknob. The wind rustled through the oaks, whispering through the branches as I stared at the man who used to be my son. He shifted his weight, glancing down at his feet like a child caught sneaking cookies before dinner. I just want to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I swallowed hard, my fingers flexing on the doorknob. For a moment, I let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of it press against my chest. Then I stepped aside, the door creaking as it swung open. "Come in," I said, my voice steady. "But you're not going to like what I have to say." The porch light flickered softly, casting long shadows across the wooden boards beneath my feet. The air was still, heavy with the smell of pine and distant rain. Jason stood just outside the door, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground like he couldn't quite bring himself to meet my gaze. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. He hadn't changed much. He was still tall, still held that posture that bordered on arrogance. But there was something different now, something frayed around the edges. His hair was longer, streaked with gray I didn't remember, and his eyes were hollow, rimmed with sleeplessness. He finally looked up, his voice coming out in a whisper. "Mom, I'm sorry." I didn't move, didn't blink. I'd practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times, told myself I'd keep my heart still and my voice calm. But standing here, facing the boy I had once rocked to sleep, the boy I had saved and scraped for, it was harder than I'd imagined. For what? I asked simply. My voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It just held steady. His eyes flickered with something. Regret, maybe, or desperation. For everything. For the house. For what I did to you. He swallowed hard. I didn't know it would go this far. I stared at him, unblinking. Didn't know? I repeated softly. You signed the papers. You made the phone calls. You handed me a tray at your birthday party and laughed while you took everything. Your grandfather left me. He flinched, but I didn't stop. And you think just showing up here with a half-hearted apology and tired eyes is enough? Jason ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Sophie? She pushed me. She said it was just business, that it would be quick and easy. I didn't think... He paused, looking out toward the oak trees that lined the property. I didn't think you'd find out. There it was. The truth, hanging in the cool evening air. Not regret for what he'd done, but for getting caught. I stepped forward, folding my arms tighter across my chest. Sophie didn't hold the pen. Jason. She didn't forge my signature. She didn't trick me when I was coming out of surgery. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle between us. That was you. His head dropped again, shoulders slumping like the weight of it all was finally pressing down. I needed a way out. I needed the money. She said we could flip it, make it back, and everything would be fine. I sighed, my breath coming out in a soft, controlled exhale. And was it? He shook his head slowly. No. His voice broke just slightly. I lost everything. My business. Her real estate license. It's all gone. I looked at him carefully, studying the lines etched into his face, the tiredness in his eyes. I remembered him at 5 years old, holding my hand as we walked through the grocery store. I remembered him at 16, pointing to the Jeep on Main Street, saying someday. I remembered all of it, and still, I didn't know this man standing in front of me. You made your choices, Jason, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. You made them without me. You made them knowing they'd hurt me. He flinched, but he didn't argue. His eyes found mine, glassy and red. Do you hate me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied honestly. I don't hate you, but I don't know you anymore. And I don't think I want to. His breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, something that might shatter whatever was left between us. But he didn't. He just looked at me, his eyes raw and pleading. And I knew I couldn't give him what he wanted. I straightened, my hand resting lightly on the doorknob. You should go. Jason took a step back, his shoulders sagging. He nodded, eyes still locked on mine, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. He turned, his footsteps heavy against the gravel path, and made his way back to the road. I watched him go, his figure getting smaller with each step, until finally, he was gone. I shut the door quietly, the lock clicking into place with a finality that felt like peace. I leaned against the wood, eyes slipping closed as I let the silence settle in. Not the sharp, cutting silence of betrayal, but the soft, soothing kind that comes with acceptance. I moved back through the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight, until I reached the small wall mount by the kitchen. Hanging there, still pristine, still gleaming under the soft light, was the key to the Jeep Grand Cherokee. I reached out and touched it, running my finger over the cold metal. I hadn't seen it since that night, since I walked out of that party, with my head held high and my heart shattered. Now, it was just a symbol of strength, of resolve, of everything I had built back from ashes. I smiled to myself, just a small thing, barely there. And I knew I had won, not with rage or revenge, but with truth and the unyielding decision to move forward, to rebuild. I left the key there, hanging as a reminder, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd reclaimed. My life, my house, my peace.